because they're small ethnic groups, and India is a big country, so small is like a couple million people. So you see these groups militarize, make their own rules, they build kingdoms. You see this type of seizing of power from the so-called lowest Varna.
Understanding how these social structures and political systems work from an Indian context made you more engaged in the Western sort of context as well.
I realized American politics don't really apply to India. However, vice versa, that definitely applies. Donald Blue, he describes politics in India as a blood sport. Both the British government and later the Indian government, they would form policies based on caste. Whatever is here is found everywhere. Whatever is not isn't found anywhere.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Three Face Podcast. Today we have with us Akshar Patel, who is the Emissary. He's a socio-political analyst, and we're very grateful to have him today join us. We also have Rajas from DDU with us. You guys might remember Rajas from the previous podcast we had with him, where we delved into how DDU started and everything. But yeah, welcome, guys. How are you guys doing today?
Akshar, chilling, bro.
Good.
What about you guys?
Yeah, solid. It's a really nice day, to be honest. It's good.
How's America?
Yeah, how's
it's
America
right after it's right after a pretty crazy day. Yeah. So it depends. Either people are really happy or really blown.
I saw on your Twitter you had like a party or something, election party.
Yeah. It was a small thing. So we were just watching the results and stuff. It wasn't anything too fancy. So yeah, it was good. It was a good time. It was fun.
Nice. I think we were just discussing before, we're like, because you posted a story yesterday on like your Instagram saying that this is a really big election and don't take it lightly, and take the opportunity to really go into really sort of make your statement for the country. We're curious as to like what angle you were coming from for that.
I think the rhetoric in the election was kind of, I don't want to say extreme, but it was serious. So, on one hand, you have Trump and his crowd who just want to tear down the institutions. Like they have they have a aura of vengeance about them, and they really want to change things, and they want to finish what they started, especially Trump. And I think Trump is a bit wised up versus before, how to navigate politics and how to deal with certain people who are part of the establishment. On the other hand, I think when it came to Harris, I mean, it's the establishment trying to keep hold of things. One thing that really started to tilt, I think, in the last few days was when they start talking about like censorship, and there's some influencers or media people or academics who talk about kind of defenestrating Elon and kind of government retribution on private players. America's all about the money. America is a very entrepreneurial country, and that kind of notion, it's definitely a departure from the usual. So essentially it's less government control versus more government control, but this time it was a bit more pronounced. So that's why I think it was a fork.
Yeah, okay. That's yeah, I think the whole world was watching. Everyone all across the world had a lot of thoughts on what was happening all throughout yesterday. Yeah, I think lots of people were very surprised, and lots of people were also some people were like, oh, this was predictable, and some people were obviously very, very happy. But yeah,
so, I think for me, I was a bit in shock, but it's going to be an entertaining few years at least. I feel like Trump is charismatic. The meme potential will be there.
At least that, yeah. If nothing else.
Yeah.
If nothing else. Maybe I was just going to ask Akshar, would be just for our audiences who haven't maybe come across yourself before, would just be keen to hear a bit about yourself and your story, just to maybe kick off this podcast, in terms of how you got into this space, starting your YouTube channel, and your thought leadership around the social and political affairs of India. What drew you into this world, and tell us your story.
I don't see myself as a thought leader, but thanks for that. I guess I'm more of an observer, and I try to be right when I can. Do you want to know, I guess, the long story of how I got into it, or maybe like a summary, or
I think maybe give us like the medium version.
Yeah.
Medium version.
Okay. Yeah, I guess ever since I was little, I was always kind of interested in India. And I was interested about Hinduism. I'd go on like Wikipedia when we finally got internet, and it was still dial-up back then. So I would go on Wikipedia or different websites and just learn about Hinduism and India and stuff like that. So I always had a latent interest. Then in college, I didn't really care much. But after college, when I started working, I'd have downtime at work and I would just go on Reddit and stuff. And at first, it was mostly around soccer. I was really interested in that. And then somehow I found my way onto like R India, or like these Indian Reddits. Now it has an infamous representation or reputation for being very, shifted one way. In this case, really left wing. But back then, it was, it was a battleground. You get to see different perspectives, and you get to see kind of this, war going on of minds. And there's a lot of history to it, and kind of reignited a lot of my latent interest in India. And eventually, I guess that got me writing. Um, I I first started just arguing with people on Reddit. I studied economics, so I was doing my JD job as like a financial analyst. At night, I get into fights with these people and waste my time. But yeah, then in real life, 2016 hit around, so everything got political then. And once Trump came about, everything just got political. Before, no one really cared. But by that time, politics would be like a normal conversation just in real life. And from there, I kind of realized like a lot of Indian Americans were ill-informed. And, I got into some fights in real life, not like physical fights, but, verbal sparring about politics, some intense stuff, especially early on. Um, and for me, it was like, I don't know, I think a lot of Indian Americans, to me, they felt really uninformed, and I super disagreed with their opinions. So I decided to start writing actually. Make a blog, spam my links on Twitter, uh, I guess write a little bit, short tweets on Twitter. You couldn't do long ones back then. But yeah, I just kept writing and writing and writing, and it just got bigger and bigger. And then I decided to start doing YouTube because, I traveled in India for a few months, and I noticed everyone was on like YouTube, everyone had a phone, everyone had a smartphone. That was pretty nice, and they would always be watching stuff. So I kind of realized video was a new wave, and I didn't want to ever go on video, but I had to. So that's how I started doing videos, and now it's the same process of learning how to make videos and, just keep posting and posting and posting and see where it takes me.
Yeah, no, that's a really cool story. So for those who don't know, his publication page where you can read all of Akshar's long form content is theemissary.co, and his YouTube channel is The Emissary. I really like the name The Emissary. It's like I think when I first found, even when like Rajas told me your name, I would still refer to you as The Emissary. It's like, oh, hey man, like The Emissary messaged me or something like
That's
like
funny.
he replied or something.
What does that mean? What does that?
Yeah, why did you
mean to
choose that?
I think I told you guys the long version offline about the night I decided to make it.
Give us
I
the
got into like
medium.
yeah, I guess I got into a fight in New York. I was at a party, and we went out during the day. It was like a thing called SantaCon, and it's ridiculous. Everyone was dressed in like Santa costumes, like girls and guys, like elf costumes. I was in literally like a one piece, and elf costume. So you see these people, we're all in my friend's apartment, which is super small. It's obviously New York, so it's like cramped. We're in a closet and we're eating pizza before going out. And yeah, we just get to talking about Indian politics and no, sorry, politics, just regular politics. I didn't really care that much around the time, but just to troll him, I was like, yeah, why are you guys talking shit about Donald Trump? He's our president, he's doing a great job. Back then I didn't really care about, Donald Trump or Hillary. I voted for Hillary back then, but after that, I just turned off my mind. I didn't pay attention much to politics. And these people, they're from New York, they're from New Jersey, we're in Manhattan, and they have the opinions you think they would have. So they exploded. These are all Indian Americans too. So a bunch of them exploded. It started, getting really heated, and I calmed them down. I was like, yeah, I'm just kidding. Now, a friend of a friend had heard about, I guess, me from our common friend, and he knew I was a big fan of Modi. So he brings up, yeah, what do you think about Modi? And I was like, he's fucking awesome, man. Like he's dope as hell. That's when, things really went south because, some people started screaming, genocide, blah, 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 Nazi. They just went full on, exactly what you would think back then. And some people even still today.
Yeah.
And, like I said, we went out the whole day. So I was going back at it. And eventually we had to get calmed down. It just ruined my night. And then, we went out the next day. I had to go back home. But on the bus ride back home with my friends, I don't know. I just had a bad feeling. Like I just had a bad taste in my mouth from the night before. So I decided to make the blog that night. And it was just a light bulb moment, dude. It was like, yeah, this shit sounds cool. So, yeah, let me just do the emissary. It just popped up.
This is super cool. It sounds like a superhero story, like the emissary.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it.
And turn villain, like
yeah.
But going back to something you said earlier, you said that a lot of Indian Americans, because I see that community as a very productive and proud community. They're not shy of taking on that identity mantle. And yet when it comes to taking on the deeper levels of the identity, whatever that means to the individual, they become reserved. They feel uncomfortable with those kinds of that kind of terminology. Why do you think that is? What is something that you've come across that has allowed you to give up this filter or maintain the filter, depending on how you look at it?
I don't know why I'm the way I am, like why I chose this side or well, I'm Hindu. I guess that's the main one. And I was always interested in Hinduism as a religion or as a just philosophy, I'd say. And I was always kind of religious, definitely more religious than the average Indian American. And I would say myself, I'm religious now, not like super, super religious, but more than the average Indian American. And I think for Indian Americans, you're basically asking why are they not as engaged or not, they don't really put on as much for India or Indian America, just being Indian.
Not exactly like put on as much, because I do feel like people do. They'll actively, at least at the racial level, they'll very proudly take on that identity. But when it comes to some of the more deeper things, let's say historical context, religious philosophies, and comfort with religious terminology and adopting them as part of their own. I feel like the Western Indian community struggles there, but you don't. And
Okay.
like I feel like it's so one of the things that you talk about is identity stacks. Let's just say that this stack has never been added, or it's just missing.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. Firstly, I think it's because there's two really big things. The first one, let's talk about religion. And one big reason, but definitely not the total reason of me being really into India, is because, I went to Mandir since I was really young. It's been a big part of my life. And like there were always youth programs at the mandir I went to. And some mandirs, whatever sampradaya they are, they have them. But a lot of kids, they weren't really exposed to that. So, how do you learn about your religion? Well, when I grew up, which is the late 90s and then the 2000s, I was born in the 90s. Um, Indian Americans weren't all that like well off versus now. A lot of them were still struggling. Uh, their parents would work, extra hours or work very grueling work. Especially, those in like business communities or stuff like that. So the parents just wouldn't have that much time to transmit those type of values essentially to their kids. They just tell their kids, yo, just study your ass off. Like make sure you study and make sure you make something of yourself. Your Indianness, as long as you eat Indian food, as long as you celebrate our festivals, you put on like a kurta every few, months, like whatever. Okay, that's enough. Hey, watch this TV serial with us. That's enough. I think Indians in India, they take Hinduism kind of for granted because it's all around them, and not in a bad way. It's just a natural process. Hinduism is all around you. You do your festivals naturally. You celebrate your holidays naturally. Like you walk outside your house, and it's like all around you. It screams at you. Um, it's there everywhere. So they're used to that type of practice of religion. But that's not how it is in America. You walk outside and you're in like a suburb or a city where there's no other Indians. There's not like a random temple for Ganesh on the street. You don't see all these Diwali lights all the time or something, or a random ritual or procession going around. It's just not like that. So that's one major reason, I think. Just the nature of Hinduism and, just not that emphasis for when we were growing up most of the time.
Yeah, and I think being in Australia, I think we can relate very similar dynamic here of, you're in terms of passing down culture and things like that, it's a more active thing that needs to be done because like you said, in India, it's all around you and you just, even if your parents don't necessarily do it, you absorb it from the community. I guess I'd be curious to know if you say you're talking to one of these examples of people that you mentioned, kind of a second generation person in say a Western country, who maybe perhaps in their life, they haven't seen the value of kind of, drawing, like as Anuraj was saying, engaging with that background of culture, religion, politics from the motherland. What kind of, I guess, based on the value you've gotten, why would you say that someone should be interested to find out more about, say, the political systems in India or the historical context or some of this Hindu philosophy and stuff or whatever, spiritual philosophy? What's the value as a second generation that you reckon that they should explore it?
I'd say politics would probably be the last thing to learn because that's possibly the most complex. But just getting into the history and understanding your background more, I think that's really essential because at the end of the day, what really makes you Indian? Okay, your skin color, maybe your features or whatever, and that's one level. Then the next level, okay, yeah, you eat like Indian food pretty often, or at least you ate it growing up. Sometimes you do Diwali, sometimes you wear kurta or sari. Um, I think that's another level. Uh, and I think that's really basic. That's not going to transmit down. Your kids aren't going to be that Indian.
Yeah.
If you want to really transmit your culture, and I think it's culture that makes people. It's not really, yeah, genetics are important, obviously. That's what makes us, look the way they are, look the way we are, and certain things we inherit from our parents. But to be a people, you need to have like a uniting culture. You need to have a uniting traditions, sometimes ideology, definitely customs. I would say rituals as well. I think that's what really makes a people a people.
So I guess just taking that a step further though, because I mean, if you're saying that the main benefit of learning this stuff is kind of cultural preservation, someone in the second gen world might say, well, why do I want to preserve that culture? What value am I getting from that in terms of navigating my day-to-day life, in terms of my career and my hobbies and things like that? What am I going to get by learning? You said politics is down that list, but all these other rituals and traditions, why should I bother doing it if it's just to preserve it? Like, I don't have the attachment to it to want to preserve it. So why, why should I have attachment to it otherwise?
I think to add to that question, I want to say, like, instead of, you mentioned that some of the other things like wearing the sari, eating the food is a little bit skin deep. And I think, to your point, Chetan, well, why should you preserve it? I think it's because some of the deeper layers are much further than skin deep, because they relate to frameworks of life. They relate to frameworks for like life and death, societal structures and things like that. But yeah, Akshar, what would be your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The philosophic answer, and if you read like someone like Nassim Taleb or some of these traditionalists, they will tell you that traditions are like heuristics and they help you guide your life because they've been tested for like hundreds of years or thousands of years. But that answer, I think, is difficult for a lot of people to grasp. I think the more utilitarian answer, and the answer I'm going to give is it is kind of cheap, but it's real. Like, you know, Indian culture has soft power because it seems like a lot of people have uses for it. So, when it comes to yoga or Ayurveda, especially meditation is getting huge now. All these words and all the stuff you learn about them, again, they're pretty, they're the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more deep things behind it. And when you see the entirety of it, and then that's when you start getting into philosophy and you get into history and you get into, a lot deeper knowledge systems around these things. There's like veganism or vegetarian or whatever. These things, for whatever reason, are mainstream, or they're getting mainstream in American or Western culture. So they seem to have some utilitarian use. They help people. And yeah, you get to learn all those things and you get to learn the meaning behind them. I think when you see the rest of the iceberg, or you interact with it, that's a lot stronger. Those practices become a lot more deeper and rooted, and that's when they could really, transmit to future generations, as well as improve your life.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess what I'm hearing is, like, I guess for a lot of these traditions, and there's knowledge in there that's like useful knowledge of just how to live. And maybe what you're saying is, if not to like adopt all these traditions, it's even just have the awareness to take what you need from it. Because I think my challenge has been, or not challenge, but the thing I've been sort of grappling with is like, a lot of that knowledge was obviously timeless, and just things like you said about meditation, Ayurveda, like these are just things that the human experience needs. But some of these things I also feel like were fit for the society of the time of India, the things of how, say, the social and political structures work. And the things I think of sometimes, it's like, how much is that going to benefit me learning about how that society works to navigate this society today? But as you said, maybe the first step is just learn it, understand it, and then there'll probably be some parallels that you can take away.
Another aspect of this conversation is also that a lot of the traditions and the customs that, let's say, build up, say, Hinduism or Indian culture are quite ethnically grounded. They're very tribal in their the way they get passed on, the way they get created. It's about shared memory a lot of the times, and across the expanse of the subcontinent, not everyone ends up having that same shared memory. And so many of the customs that, I guess, different parts of Indians, or different areas of Indians end up practicing, they are quite localized. And the way they get passed on, and I think that's one of the part and parcel of the struggle of this whole thing, is that what you're trying to pass on is something that's quite limited to, let's say, your group or your in-group or your people. And then there's this overarching culture that everyone tries to have a say in. And I think that goes a little bit further into why it's so complicated to even define these things such as Indian culture or Hindu culture. It's because it's ethnically bound. And I guess that's when we go into things like caste, right?
So just to add one thing, so are we saying that knowledge is disproportionately shared in Hinduism across different castes, and everybody's got their own like different like shared knowledge or understanding of it, but different castes have quote unquote more or less understanding or more relevance towards upholding, say, more traditional forms of what Hinduism is, just due to, I guess, where they place. Is that what it's about?
So I would say, the examples I gave, they're pretty cosmopolitan or universal, especially in the modern context. When it comes to individual traditions, so like for me, and I think for a lot of, Indian diaspora, caste just isn't a thing. Like I didn't know my caste until like my 20s. Um, I have a lot of Indian American friends who they don't really understand their caste, or they definitely don't understand their Varna in many cases. They might know, okay, my last name is this, so yeah, I'm like a Patel, obviously. Or some people might know their Varna if they're a Brahmin or something. But it's very confusing for a second generation, and I don't blame them. They just don't really know because it's, whenever we're all hanging out, it's not like, oh, what's your caste? What's your this? It's a lot more about regional stuff. Like, hey, I speak Gujarati, you speak Punjabi, oh, you speak Kashmiri, and et cetera, et cetera. But when it's about history and traditions and like what what you're carrying on, I think for a diaspora, it's definitely again a lot more regional based. However, for some people, it might be caste, and that's when you get into this whole new dimension of, what is caste. And I guess we could kind of segue into that because that is how you understand a lot of India because it's been there for a very long time.
Yeah, I think I'd be really keen to hear your take on that, Akshar. Like, in terms of, I think, when Hinduism and stuff is often brought up, one of the first critiques that are given is like, oh, but the caste system, that's not relevant, and that's often used as a straw man that probably the rest of the ideas are maybe not relevant as well. So I guess curious to hear your take on. You mentioned a few words. We've said a few things like caste, ethnic group, Jati. What is the relevance of all of this? Maybe if you want to frame it more in the context of as a second gen, when I have been told that I have X, Y, Z for all these, what should I take away from that? How do I apply that? Is there any relevance? Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I think before we go into that, should we define it first? At least that's how it is. So
let's start by defining
today.
Sure.
So just maybe we go in the context of Varna, Jati, and category, just to make it a little bit more relevant to understanding India today as well.
Sure. Yeah. I'll preface it by saying I don't think caste is that relevant for diaspora. Maybe for some people it is, but I guess with this explanation, as I go into the Indian aspect and maybe the historical and contemporary aspect, you'll get the points for, what's the relevance for diaspora. So the first place we could start off with is Varna. And, that's the most probably ancient expression of caste, at least via a word we know of. And initially there's 4 castes: Brahmins, usually the priests or, knowledge people or teachers or whatever; Kshatriyas, the warriors, the kings; Vaishyas, who are the mercantilists and merchants, traders; and then Shudras, who do various types of labor or menial work. Could be, I don't know, in some cases engineering, art, basically everything else. Sometime later, and we can't necessarily pin it down when, but from my reading, it was mostly a consciousness of these 4 groups for a long time, at least from the Vedas onward. And, there's a big debate about, was it birth-based? Was it not birth-based? Could you was there fluidity? And I lean towards, for I think most of history, there was a lot of birth-based element to it. And I think this is just how ancient societies work. Like ancient societies have class systems, they have caste systems. Almost all ancient societies have this. So in this way, India isn't unique. You have these groups of people, you have these castes. When like the Greeks came or when the Chinese came, you could look at their primary source accounts and you could see what they commented on when they came to India. So they would notice peculiar parts of India. Hey, a lot of people are vegetarian. Or, hey, look at these Brahmins and these Shramans or these ascetics. They do a lot of asceticism. They give up a lot of stuff. Hey, look at this cool ritual. They would point out what's different. They really didn't focus that much on caste because to them, it's like, hey, this is just, how you organize society. This is an ancient practice. So Varna was this ancient practice, usually a forecast. Eventually, I think when the Chinese start coming after, I'd say 1 AD or 1 CE, I think that's when you see a lot more accounts. You start to see accounts of untouchability. And in certain Indian scriptures, you start to see words like Chandala and certain descriptors of people who would be regarded as untouchable. So you see this emergence of untouchability and people of a fifth Varna or without Varna. In the 18th century, or in modern parlance, we call them Dalits. But initially, they were kind of grouped with Shudras, but later they would be, you know, their own separate thing. So you see 5 Varnas, and you see this rise of untouchability and this kind of new practice, we could say. So that's one level. I think the second level, which you have to layer on top, and a lot of people, they think of this caste system as a pyramid, and they see it as like an oppression structure, literally an oppression pyramid. I think it's a lot more complex to that. And again, I want to put it with the context of all societies seem to have this type of class system, you know, like the Aztec Empire was not, you know, modern day Sweden or something like that. Or like Renaissance Italy wasn't, you know, it didn't have UBI or anything. Not everyone was treated the same. So societies had these class systems, including India. But what made India a bit more unique was when Jati came. And this also kind of overlays and breaks up this system of oppression, or, you know, this idea of an oppression pyramid. Jati, I think the best way to think about it is like a small ethnic group, because this is the most salient expression of caste in India today, and most likely in ancient times as well. So you'll have these small groups scattered all across India, very localized. They have their own customs, they have their own traditions, they have their own dharma or way of life, they have their own rules, they police themselves many times, and they do their own thing. And it becomes very, very salient in around like 500 AD, I'd say, where we start to see genetic evidence of things freezing. So a lot of these jatis start to form into, you know, these clusters, and they stop intermarrying with other people. So you see a calcification of the caste system. And to pair it with Varna, because I know this is super confusing, but a lot of these jatis are within Varnas. So, you know, there's Brahmin jatis, there's Kshatriya jatis, there's Vaishya jatis. And this is where we see some mobility as well. We see some rising of people, we see some falling of people. You see one interesting thing, I guess no one ever really talks about when it comes to caste, because they focus a lot at the top, like Brahmins and stuff, and sometimes Kshatriyas as well. But technically the lowest or like second lowest castes, like Shudras, these groups, because they're small ethnic groups, and, you know, India is a big country, so small is like a couple million people, and that's a significant amount. But they have a lot of ethnic consciousness. They have a lot of consciousness that, hey, we're one people, we have our own traditions, we have X, Y, and Z, you know, this, that. So you see these groups militarize. You see these groups, you know, take up arms, make their own rules, they build kingdoms, and they start defining their own empires and their own ways of life. And these types of, you know, interactions with the caste systems or occurrences within the caste system, you don't really hear about, but this is a common occurrence in India. You see it all across India, where you see this type of mobility, or you see this type of seizing of power from the so-called lowest Varna. So that's a unique aspect.
Just a question on that. Because you said that a lot of these jatis would fall within Varnas, if some of these jatis would militarize and then they would become militarily dominant, and they would form government, they would handle, you know, borders and everything. Does that mean that they are now treated as a kshatriya?
Sometimes
Or
yes,
do they...
sometimes no.
Okay.
So sometimes, I'm going to speak very gingerly because people in India get very, very offended sometimes when you claim this descent. Like casteism is real. Like it's definitely real. Um, I think some groups, I'm not going to name them, but some groups, they were known to have Shudra origins and then they become a Kshatriya. There are groups who stayed Shudra and they would kind of proudly say it. I think there was a king from what's now Andhra Pradesh or a dynasty from Andhra Pradesh or like Telangana. I'm pretty sure they were Telugu speaking, somewhere in South India. But they basically brag about being descended from the feet of Narayan or Vishnu. And, it's said in the Vedas that the Shudras come from the feet of this, Parabrahman or this, universal God, essentially. So they brag about it. They say, we are the descendants of the feet of the mighty Lord. And they wear it with pride. So it's one really important point about caste is that it is very heterogeneous across time and space. And this is something I feel like in India, this is a civilization, sorry, that's so vast, that's so ancient, that you can find an anecdote for everything. You can find an anecdote for everything. You could extrapolate it everywhere. You could say all of India was like this. This is a common mistake in Indian history. And one way to kind of battle against this is you have to see recurring patterns and you have to see the differences and accept that, hey, maybe, there's different expressions of caste across time, across region. And that is one of the most important contexts of caste, I'd say. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to our earlier thing of, I mean, India, it's such a, like Anuraj was saying, coming from these tribal origins, it's hard to make generalizations when it's such a rich tapestry of all these different sub microcosms of cultures. But as you said, that maybe looking for those patterns, like I guess in terms of the Varna system you described, I think in terms of different occupations and role-based classes in society, I think that aspect is probably not as controversial. Like in every society, you have different roles that exist, different jobs. I think the part maybe which gets the more controversial aspect is that, that I think you mentioned the oppression pyramid of kind of why there's this hierarchy between classes. And I guess, could you tell us what informs that hierarchy? Like what is it possible to have that class system of these different groups without a hierarchy, or are they just intertwined for some reason? And so why does a hierarchy exist? Can it exist without a hierarchy?
Sorry, if I could just add onto that question, I think the other aspect to why the caste system uniquely cops like a lot of scrutiny is the fact that they associate divinity with each class as well, which doesn't really exist in other forms. You mentioned about like if you have this social structure originating from a scripture which many people think is literally from, like they call the Vedas authorless, right? That tends to really imprint in people's mind that, oh, if I'm a Brahmin, or not in people's mind, but a lot of people who don't have too much context on what these, caste or Varna, what these structures are and were, that this is just a very inherent part of the spiritual tradition. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to add on to Chetan's thing about that's where I feel a lot of people get very confused and kind of caught up. And I was curious on your take on that as well.
So I think, like I said, most at least civilized or agricultural societies or, just a kingdom or whatever, they have some type of hierarchy. That's just how most humans work. When it comes to caste, yeah, that theological or religious aspect is definitely an important thing. And that ritualization of these differences, of this system, that's a unique part. And that's a double-edged blade, I'll say. So the reason I say that is, one, it gives a lot of diversity. Each community has their own customs and practices and ways to express their dharma or Hinduism or whatever. So that's definitely a true aspect. But when it comes to this vertical aspect, I would say that I have to think a little bit about this.
It's a sensitive topic, so
Yeah, no,
don't want to get canceled. But no, I mean, like, I guess I'm part of the question is coming from, is it that maybe it was more relevant for a certain time in history, and maybe we've outgrown that relevance? Like, you know, part of the, you know, issues we see today, with the those lower classes being the Dalits and stuff, is an underrepresentation in politics and stuff, which perhaps maybe less of an issue when, again, it's more these tribal community level politics and systems. But now when it's kind of globalized, then it's like nationalized, then they're not getting that representation, and you know, that's causing problems. So is it more that at some point that system worked, and maybe these issues that are now coming is more that system just hasn't evolved? Is that part of the problem?
Can I just like sort of chime in here?
Sure.
I think one of the questions you asked, Chetan, was where the pyramid is the problem, and the pyramid is what gets chastised most of the time. And you're asking whether it can exist without the pyramid itself. From what I gather from your content, Akshar, I feel like it already is like that, in the sense these ethnic groups in modern Indian day democracy are just battling for more, let's say, government representation. And currently, whether you're Brahmin or whether you're I don't want to even use the term Brahmin. Let's use like a little more Jati-based term. Like if you're, say, Trivedi Mewada or something, and there's less of you, but there's more of, say, Rajput people in your area, you're technically this higher on this like theological pyramid, but in terms of how it expresses itself in today's day and age, it's kind of more it's more the number is actually what gives you your stake.
So really good observation. Let me give that initial context, what you were saying, Chetan, and then we could go on to the political aspect, because the contemporary aspect is different. And so yeah, there was definitely verticality. There was definitely casteism between communities. There was casteism between Varna or inside Varnas. Like some Brahmins would say they're higher than other Brahmins. Some Dalits would say they're higher than other Dalits, and they would practice untouchability on each other in some cases. So this always was there, and I think even this contemporary aspect of say certain communities using their muscle or numbers to enact, I don't know, I don't want to say like wrath onto other communities. Sometimes it was yes, or maybe enact an advantage onto other communities. That also happened in the past. And one thing, you know, I could get away with this saying this because I'm not a Brahmin. But when you think about what a Brahmin was, especially in ancient times, very ancient times, and the Greeks called their lifestyle like a Spartan. They compare them to Spartans because they had this very ascetic lifestyle. They're technically at the top of the pyramid. They have the vow of Bhiksha. And if you read something like the Dhammapad, Buddha has a chapter on Brahmins, and he lays out why, you know, it's so admirable that these people commit Bhiksha, and, you know, eventually he calls his own monks like bhikkhus after this vow of Bhiksha, of begging for alms. This is really unique for a top of the pyramid type of person. You don't see this type of expression of social structures in most other places. On the flip side, you also don't see untouchability in certain cultures, or most, if not, definitely not. I mean, there's certain other cultures that do have it, but I'm just laying out the idiosyncrasies of caste. And this is why that, you know, vertical pyramid isn't necessarily the best way to look at these things. And I guess to finally close it out and give another steelman argument for the other side, over time, if you read like some of the earlier Dharma Shastras, there's first of all, there's multiple ones, and these are ancient documents. Some they apply to different areas of India depending on time and, you know, context. But many times they would have punishments for the so-called upper or Dvija caste if they strayed from their duties. Some of them would have punishments for lower caste if they engaged in some type of, you know, Dvija ritual or duty or whatever. So you have all these conflicting things. Some might be true, some might not be. And again, I think you have to look at the recurring aspects of what's going on and how caste kind of evolves. So I know I'm kind of like jumbling a lot of things here, but my biggest overall point is you need to view this as a fluid social structure in most cases. It changes over time. It is unique in terms of this endogamous thing. You see it with genetics, especially over the past 1500 years. But when it comes to its actual practice and how it was expressed in a cultural domain, it's been very varied. And it's been mostly normal compared to other cultures who have hierarchical systems.
Hey, Akshar,
Now, sure.
I just wanted to ask a question. I was kind of curious about this. Just from, I guess, from the outside of things, and more from an identification perspective. This is a question that I've had for a while. But how would like a second generation person, someone who's probably not so attached to their Indian identity, how would they be able to identify like what caste they're like people or Varna that their people are as? I know you mentioned earlier that you learned your caste, I think, in your 20s. So is there like a way to figure out like, I don't know, online or something that where your caste belongs to outside of familial and geographical base?
Or to not make it sound like we're trying to promote everyone's caste consciousness, Dylan just wants to understand, like, if you had to trace your family history, how would you do it?
Yeah, and like, yeah.
Am
I a warrior or not?
I don't.
Yeah.
You can be a warrior if you want.
Am I an ancient aesthetic warrior or not, dude?
I would say obviously familial is the first point, and that's the most accurate point. And then you could just look it up in terms of journals. There is a lot of castes, like I said, there's genetics on it. So castes cluster into it's ethnic groups. It really is like it's ethnic groups when it comes to genetics. It expresses the exact same way, its own culture. Yeah, you could find it. There's a lot of academic journals on a lot of these different castes. You'd be surprised. For whatever reason, I think once Western Indologists really came into India, they picked up a lot of these different caste traditions. They recorded them. There's some that aren't recorded. India's so diverse, but yeah, the first line is definitely your parents. They will tell you about your background. They'll probably tell you some made up story about your caste too, how you're descended from this king or this god or whatever, and you can believe it too. There's nothing wrong with that either.
Yeah.
But every caste has its fantastic origin story. We can believe it, we can't believe it, but it is what it is.
No, I guess I was just kind of curious because I guess my own personal genesis is like from Bangladesh. So I know that the caste system wasn't as prominent with like the Muslim social system at the time. But like just I'm also curious to know like from that perspective, like how do like ethnic groups in other parts of South Asia kind of to identify their caste? Do they have an attachment to caste as strongly as Indians do? Like not Indians, but like Indian groups do, you know?
You're unique. So one of my friends, Razib Khan, he's told me this. He's a geneticist. In Pakistan, especially in the east of the Indus, which is it basically historically was India. You see caste stratification in those areas, and even till today, you see this. I think they call it the Birdari system.
Yeah.
Especially in Punjab, they still kind of express caste, probably not as much as Indians, but historically they did. You're from Bangladesh, you said, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So he told me he's Bangladeshi as well. He told me caste was a lot weaker in especially east of Bengal, where Bangladesh is today historically. And Bengalis have told me, I know there are Bengali Brahmins. They're infamous in India for various reasons, but I've heard from Bengalis, both Brahmin and non-Brahmin, that caste in Bengal just isn't that strong of a thing. And there are definitely castes there, but it seems the consciousness isn't as high. And in East Bengal, historically, caste was not that big of a thing. You don't see the genetic stratification as you do in the rest of India. So there are unique cases like that,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think just kind of going off Dylan's question, I think I'm still kind of thinking back to kind of, the relevance aspect, because like, let's say someone does, look up their family history or the name, and it kind of says that name is usually associated with this caste. I think, like, so just going back to the thing of how caste was even determined, you touched on it, but just around, you described that these are just various occupations, but then it's kind of determined by your family origin as well. I guess my take on my retrofitting of history, just my version, is maybe it was more based on your occupation, but then generally, if you're a farmer, then your kid would be a farmer and his kid would be a farmer. So like that, it kind of transmitted through birth as well. Like your occupation and birth would kind of align. I guess in terms of the modern day, is it possible that we can almost choose our Varna in the sense of, the occupation that we are doing or the lifestyle we are living? This is what I'm most sort of the group that I'm kind of most closest to. And okay, so what? And then I guess, have you found being so, once you discovered your Varna, like what did you do with that? Like, did you, when you kind of went to Hinduism, did you kind of then find certain texts that would support the lifestyle that, you wanting to lead, whether it's, for example, you want to become a government official or a warrior or a priest or an academic or, just a worker in general, that you can get specific guidance to that adventure that you want to choose? Like, is that an option?
Since the Hindu, sorry, go ahead if you want.
No, I think that was really it. I think this is just an idea of how we can sort of create relevance and adapt it for the modern era. I guess it's a question of class mobility and
since the Hinduism I always practiced, it was casteless. I and my parents, we come from a very unordinary group of people. We're just historic farmers and stuff. We don't have any like royal lineages or any cool thing we did in the past. So because of that, I never really, even when I discovered it, I just didn't care about my caste because there's no unique caste history really. There's fantastical stories about, oh, hey, we descended from, this person and that person, and but we're unordinary people, honestly. So I think because of that, I was always interested just in Hinduism at large. And when I was growing up, I was always interested in Hindu philosophy and ontology and like, the Itihasa and Purans and these stories. Like what is the Atman? How does karma function? How does reincarnation function? Um, what is moksha and stuff like that. So these are very, since Hinduism has so much, we've talked a lot about the family aspect and the, grahastha aspect, the ancestral aspect, which are really important. There's a lot of rituals about ancestors, about ancestral traditions and everything. But for me personally, I was always interested, I guess, in the more individualistic aspect of Hinduism. These, like I said, these ideas about Atman, how does one perform bhakti? How can you fight these evils of like ego, anger, lust, greed, and stuff like that? This is a lot more individualistic. So I guess my personal example, I just I never had a attachment to like those ancestral aspects. And then when I found out I guess my Jati or caste, like I don't come from a special group. So like there's not much to dig up. So I guess I'm a unique case in that aspect, I'd say.
I think one way I like to try and map on the ancient Varna system into today's day and age, like you said, they're just groups of occupations. So a lot of the times, at least in the United States, people talk a lot about the military-industrial complex, and how they're a band that like sort of sticks together and they push for policy and they make things go in their direction. And a lot of the times, the people that are against the military industrial complex are these top university professors with their ivory tower, that's what they call it, ivory tower sort of position of like reading society, coming up with theories for society. And a lot of the let's say, not the bottom rung, but let's say the professional rung of people who tend to form the ranks within the military industrial complex as just the workers, right? And so I see this as a very clear, Kshatriya Vaishya alliance that is struggling against the Brahmin Shudra alliance, right? Because they're the ones with the power, and these are the people that are trying to reduce that and sort of redistribute it across. And I don't even know if this is like a very clear Democrat Republican, but it just seems like that. It seems like, the military industrial complex is sort of like a Republican Kshatriya Vaishya alliance, and the Democrats tend to have a lot of the support of the universities and your average man and woman, who tend to be like the Brahmin Shudra alliance, just as a way of mapping it into today's day and age. What are your thoughts on something like that?
To kind of go off that, and I guess to better answer your question, Chetan, because I realized I didn't totally answer it. Dude, Varna, you can make these comparisons, but when it comes to like a traditional understanding of Varna, it's not as relevant today. And I should answer your earlier question, Anuraj, about category, because that's probably what we should start talking about now. Varna, there's some value for it today. I definitely say in contemporary India, there is like cultural capital to being a Brahmin or a Vaishya or maybe a Kshatriya. Definitely not as much as it was back in the day, but there is some residual cultural capital. I'd definitely say that that's a thing. And I'd say there's also some stigma even today to being like a Dalit, especially in rural areas. In rural areas, these things are like times 50 in India, less so in urban areas, but there's residual cultural capital to all these 4 or 5 Varnas. And for most Indians, it's a birth-based thing. Like I think if you go to India and tell them you're Brahmin and you don't have a Brahmin last name or ancestry, they're just not going to take you seriously. And this is 1.4 billion people. I don't think we could get away from these, modern notions that they have of what Varna is. I think we have to accept that. But, sorry, go ahead, Chetan.
Oh, no. I think before we move on to the category question, I was maybe just to challenge that thinking a little. Because I totally agree. I think I also agree that the oppression hierarchy-based system of Varna, to me, I don't understand the relevance or the need for that in the modern day. I think they each serve an important function in society, and there should be a level playing field there. Otherwise, it leads to oppression, discrimination. But having differences in these different guidance for each of these occupations and groups, I wonder if there is still some value in that. And I think the distinction I would make is, I would say, I think in terms of how they connect with God, or whatever you want to call that, in terms of that self-realization, I think that is the same for all of them. The Atma and Brahma, like that general thing is the same, but more so in navigating the material world, right? In terms of, for example, like I'm currently doing some startups and kind of in the business sort of Vaishya era of my life, right? I think I get a lot of value looking at some of these philosophies in terms of how do I conduct business in a way that creates prosperity and creates value, but doing it in a way that's like ethically just, right? In the sense of like impact in benefiting society, or even donating to charity and things like that. There's lessons like there which are there for Vaishyas, or like for Kshatriyas, if I'm a government official tomorrow, then how do I kind of create order and stuff, but also uphold justice and things like that. So like lessons which like that would not be relevant for the average worker person. There'd be different ethical guidance for them. But I guess to your point of the irrelevance of it, I guess I'm just questioning, is there, and maybe that hasn't been, those distinctions aren't as clearly accessible or understood. And so without that different guidance, all that's left is just like there's lines in the sand. And then it just creates like well, I'm part of this. And then it creates that tribal and then the category and then the power struggle, right? But I guess I'm saying have we just forgotten about the original intention of why we drew these lines? Was it necessarily that, creating power struggles in different groups, or is there still potentially some need to have different ethical guidance for different occupations?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
To be honest, like I haven't come across too much textually that talks about this kind of stuff. Usually it's more on the philosophical side, so it treats the person as all the same, and then it gives like a philosophical framework for like the individual's life after death, before death, etc. But in the material world, like personally, I don't know if anyone else has come across these kinds of texts as well. Akshar, maybe.
I think there are ancient texts about like particularly the Dharma Shastras and stuff that talk about, how to be a good Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, and so on. Obviously, those are ancient texts, but your question is really interesting because I think there are even people in India today that they recognize post the Industrial Revolution, the Varna system and Jati system also to a degree, but especially Varna system, it's not as relevant. So how do you reinvent it for a modern time? If the system has been so old in Hinduism for thousands of years, it has changed. It has been molded differently, there is a fluid aspect to a degree. I think that has to be acknowledged. So what's its new avatar, essentially? What's its new incarnation in modernity? I don't know that, to be honest. I think there are people in India who are trying to figure that out. And, I think you have like a good framework of mind of, hey, if I slot into this Varna, for my occupation or for my passion or whatever, how do I become the best at it? What are the ancient guides or what are the rules to be, successful in this occupation or in this duty, this dharma, essentially? And that's I think that's for future India or maybe a contemporary India to kind of decide, or Indians or people of Indian descent or Hindus or whatever. So that's a WIP, I'd say, work in progress. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Is it
for sure.
restricted to just Indians and Hindus? Like if you remove the Sanskrit element of it, I mean, someone's just saying that this person is pursuing knowledge, this person's pursuing like military and governmental kind of a life. The other person is like aiming for professional excellence, and one is aiming for, say, business excellence, right? Like if you remove the Sanskritic aspect of it, isn't it just like another human philosophy at this stage, like just guidelines and ethics for like what's the difference between, like, say, a military YouTube page that uses English to describe their like how to become the best soldier, and then someone that uses terms like kshatriya? Like, does that inherently, like, it places it geographically, but doesn't inherently change the deeper message?
So I will say the big difference would be the ritualization and the theological significance of, being a Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, and especially when it connects to Jati. But I think there is like a ritualized significance to all those terms.
Yeah.
Especially in ancient times when, as a Kshatriya or as a Brahmin or whatever, you are supposed to do these types of rituals, or you're supposed to conduct this ritual in that way. And so there's always been that ritualization of this caste or class system that you see in other areas. But in India, it's probably more ritualized than most.
And just to throw another wild card question before we move on, but something I've been thinking about is like, we talk about these lines in the sand. But then we kind of, the next thing is like, okay, well, which group do I fall in? Like, kind of how Dylan asked earlier, like which caste am I part of, or which, like my occupation, which one does that? But is it that that's too simplistic of a model, in that we actually all have qualities or can belong to multiple of these groups, right? Is the fact that they don't have to be mutually exclusive? Like can someone benefit from having both Brahminical learnings and learnings of, the Vaishya? Like, for example, the modern day Shudra, you kind of gave examples of the engineer or like lawyer and stuff. But that there, I think OG Shudra would probably be more like, physical labor and kind of work. Whereas these things, a lot of it is a pursuit of knowledge. You are just kind of in academics and learning and pushing thought leadership forward, which to me is quite Brahminical in that sense as well. So I guess, yeah, just another possible framework of it's like, yeah, choose your own adventure, but you can also choose multiple, I think. And I think then that could build bridges between these worlds. I think part of this issue is just dividing people into these different groups, which is great for, political power and things like that. But I just wonder where that WIP of the future India, it's actually more coming from a place of unity. It's like, oh, well, actually, yeah, I'm like how Anuraj was saying, the Vaishya Kshatriya industrial complex. Like I am a Vaishya Kshatriya or something. I belong to, I vibe with both of these groups, and I'm trying to grow towards both. And that's how bridges will form between them, rather than the lines between. Just thoughts.
So I think, okay, just sorry, Akshar, you go.
I was gonna say, I guess in modernity, yeah, we wear different hats, every day essentially. So yeah, I totally agree with that. Like we wear different hats every day. It's hard to pigeonhole us into one Varna, which is why, what does it really mean today? But I'll say this in regards to the historical context you put. I definitely, when I first started learning about caste, all studying seemed like it was, the realm of Brahmins. But when you actually look at Indian history, these big engineering feats, like some of these crazy temples they built, or like Wootz steel, or some of these innovations that they did in science, obviously there is a lot of Brahmins involved in them, like Aryabhatta, and especially in astronomy, mathematics, and stuff. But a lot of this innovation in terms of like this physical material innovation, or these creation of these temples, how to, precisely make the arches and the detailing of them, that is the knowledge of like, Shudras. That is the innovation of Shudras, I'd say. That's like, and I don't like viewing India as a history of caste. I think it's more helpful today to view it as a history of Indians. But if we have to view it in that lens, I would say that a lot of those physical innovations you should give, or you should view it as the pursuit of these castes. They put in most of the work. They experimented, they toiled, and then eventually they created new techniques. So, yeah, that's what I would, I guess, amend to the historical context. But I totally empathize with you that like it's natural to think every studious thing or every pursuit of knowledge is Brahminical, and maybe it is in a way. But innovation happens in clusters, and individual groups in many cases like that.
Yeah, so I guess we can move on. So go.
I was just segueing. One thing you said, Akshar, was a history of viewing Indian history as like a history of caste, or a history of Varna versus a history for Indians. That shows up a lot in today, like the modern context as well, between like, say, a massively democratic country, which is also a build-up of all these little ethnic groups. And when you were talking about people going against each other, I don't think it can happen today at a Varna level, but it predominantly just happens at a Jati level. And the government interacts with this Varna Jati matrix with their own third level or third direction to the matrix, which is category. And so I guess what I want to ask is, Western democracies tend to be more homogenous than, say, the South Asian democracies. And so India, as like the largest democratic state in the world, it has to handle so many different identities and in a lot of warring identities. So we've done now like a history of how these identities have formed, but how do they show up today? And today being like the day after another great nation just had their democratic election, it would be good to understand how, some of the pitfalls of like a stratified society or a segregated society, how it shows up today.
Yeah, so this is super important because no one talks about, like, when they talk about caste in India, they talk about Jati Varna. Everyone talks about Jati Varna, whether they're Indian, whether they're white, foreigner, whatever. It's always Jati Varna. But since 1947, if not a bit earlier, if you look at some of the colonial records and the bureaucratization of caste, it's category. Category is a third thing. Category is a third category. Maybe I have to think of a better name for it, but officially the Indian government recognizes they recognize castes as categories. So they're gonna try to be brief here. But there's essentially four major groups that kind of map to the Varna system, but definitely not totally. The first group is general castes, which is usually upper castes, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and some Shudras. So this is where you start to see these variations. Then there's OBC, which is primarily Shudra castes, but Shudras, this is the largest caste in India. It's very heterogeneous. Some Shudra castes, they were less well off back in the day. Some of them were literal kings. Some of them were something in between. And sometimes you see certain upper castes or Dvija castes thrown in this category as well. But that's probably more of a very small minority. Then there are SCs, and this is probably the most clean-cut caste. These are people from Dalit backgrounds mainly. I believe there's maybe some Shudras in there, but mostly Dalit people. And then lastly, there's scheduled tribe or tribals, people usually who are historically descended from tribal groups or groups that lived whether in the forest or on the outskirts of society. And yeah, even within this category, and you start to see this pattern, there's some groups that were very historically well off, and maybe weren't necessarily tribals per se, but they just got thrown in there via some like clerk error, or they just got in there somehow. So you have these four new castes in the Indian government, in a way kind of created from British institutions and colonialism prior, when they kind of recorded India's caste system, made it into a proper bureaucratic setup. They would do things, and this is both the British government and later the Indian government. They would form policies based on caste. So certain castes could, bear arms, certain ones could not. Some castes would be recruited into the military, some would not. Some rebellious castes would be disbarred from any like militarization or carrying any weapon. Some castes would have their land taken away, and then they would give that land to another caste. So they would enact all these different laws that were caste based. And I think in earlier India, there was probably some of that, but this was taken onto a new level. Like when you start attaching numbers and formal bureaucratic identities and you institutionalize something in a very formal way, that completely changes it. And I think this is a period where you start to see caste as just another, class system with its, little idiosyncrasies and quirks and stuff. Like, yeah, it's different, but it's mostly the same as other places. But once you see it institutionalized, like the British did, and you see this really hardening of it, and you combine that with the endogamy, which is again a really unique aspect of the Indian caste system, you see it becoming even more solid and calcified. And you see something form that is different than what it was in the past. And this is where category comes in as this aspect of Indian politics and later democracy, where you see a lot of internecine conflict between groups. You see governments cleave groups from each other. You see these new social engineering happening within the government, using policies or creating new categories, creating new subgroups and stuff. So that makes Indian democracy extremely unique.
And I think you call this term Jatitva, this idea of having a lot of government backing on, not government backing, but having a lot of government policy based at the level of different ethnic groups, one against each other, and even on the societal level, people actually accepting it and putting their ethnic identity or their identity as some historical or familial or genetic starting point, they put that identity at the very top of their identity stacks. And both from the top down to the bottom up, it's all happening as a warring nation, not a warring, but constantly bickering nation of different ethnic groups. And so I think to put it in an even wider context, something that I've seen you mention before, and something that I've seen as well, for the second gen person who doesn't really have this attachment to their ethnic group at all, or very little, and so they see the motherland, or even India, or even Hinduism, as a guideline for individual pursuits towards liberation, whereas the nation, which actually expresses itself at the level of ethnic group, and so it's like this Hindutva versus Jatitva battle that we see, that I've seen you talk about, that I also like essentially see with my own reading as well.
So
any thoughts on
I
that?
would say, yeah, so to clarify, I wouldn't say what we discussed up till now is Jatitva in total. It's caste politics, and that's an integral facet of Indian politics, caste politics. But Jatitva is something one level up. So Jatitva would be the idea that, hey, my caste is not actually a part of Hinduism, and it never was. So you create these ideas of separation. You create these ideas that, hey, my caste was never a part of Hinduism. Our traditions, which like every other Hindu kind of does, or most other Hindus do, they're not Hindu. We were actually oppressed by like the Brahmins or something, and we were tricked into becoming Hindu. And you start to, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. But this is a political thing that's happening kind of recently, and it's in a reaction to Hindutva. So I think one good way to not just think about India, but different places in general, especially diverse places, but we'll focus on India for now, is there cycles of centralization and decentralization. So in India, the one big centralization we could start from is the creation of the republic. When Nehru and the freedom fighters and Gandhi and Patel and all these other people, they created this strong central state, and they were very purposeful in creating a strong central state. They did not want a confederation. They didn't want the United South Asian States of whatever, the subcontinent or something. And they're like, no, we want to centralize India. The states, we're going to make them weaker. We want a strong central state. So you have this, time of centralization, and then it kind of unravels for whatever reason. India becomes much more chaotic, decentralized. There's a lot of churn in society, and then we could say it gets centralized again during Indira Gandhi, and then you see this cycle. So fast forward to now, when Modi became prime minister for various reasons, you started to see a huge amount of centralization in India. And centralization doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad, but you see a lot of new ideas of a cosmopolitan India, a united India, a lot of nationalism, a lot of messaging on unity, and you see it over and over and over and over again. Eventually people start to get like tired of that, or they start to fatigue, or maybe the centralization becomes a bit too much. So maybe Hindutva in this case becomes too much. And I guess just to clarify, as people don't know, Hindutva, you could say it's like the idea of Hindu politics, Hindu nationalism, making Hinduism or Dharma as a forefront of Indian politics or Indian identity, emphasizing it and kind of valuing it. Some people say Indian indigeneity or indigenous rights movement. You could call it whatever you want, but it's basically putting a primacy on Hinduism or Dharma in Indian politics and Indian society. So now that we've defined that, you see a lot of centralization, a lot of this Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, India. What does that mean to India's smaller identities that actually make up the whole? What does that mean for the parts? We have this emphasis on the whole, but what about these parts? What about linguistic states or linguistic identities? What about castes? What about, these small sects of Hinduism, their traditions and their ways of life? So you
All
start to see
dharmic
an
traditions.
anxiety. Yeah, all dharmic traditions. You start to see an anxiety, and that anxiety starts to manifest as decentralization. They start pushing back. And in this case, with Jatitwa, they will do things which I think is erroneous and it's fake, but for some people it's real and it yields political results and it yields, this new identity. It's a new form of social engineering. And for them, they will say, like I said, they'll say, like, we're not Hindu, we were never Hindu. My caste is everything, my caste is first. I want my caste guy in there. They just double down on caste politics, caste. Jati. That's what they usually say. And it just becomes a thing. And I think that's what's going on right now when it comes to Jatitva versus Hindutva, or this idea of, am I putting my Hinduism first, or am I going to put my Jati first? And for a lot of people, they'll say, hey, it's equal, or hey, it's the same. We can do both. And in a lot of cases, you can, for sure. But I think on the political realm in India, there's definitely a clash between those two ideas of, I have all these identities, as you said, the identity stack. I have my caste, I have my ethnicity, I have my Hinduism, I have, I don't know, my gender, whatever. What's most important to me at the top? For someone who adheres to Jatita, it's definitely their caste. And for someone who adheres to Hindutva, it's probably being a Hindu at the top.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, are there, sorry, Chet, I was just one thing, just as very simple, short question. Out of curiosity, would you say there are other things that people put on top, maybe in like, say Western nations? Because I feel like this kind of a model of how you express yourself at the political sphere, everyone does it. All democracies do it. Everyone in any democracy does it. So someone in, say, Western countries, or even say India, we've mentioned two things that could be at the top. But what are some other things that you as a political analyst see as people putting at the top?
In the West, I think one is obviously like gender, LGBT stuff, race, ethnicity. A curious case for Hispanics here in America, being Hispanic, or, is being Cuban or Mexican more important to me? Or is my race identity, do I identify as a white Hispanic or a black Hispanic? So in America, like diverse places, you get to see this battle in action. The other aspect here, which is kind of always in the background for any state, is economics and I guess individual welfare. Like, hey, am I getting screwed by inflation? How much did I make a lot more money? Were these 4 years kind to me? Or wow, that government is offering me, freebies. They're offering me like 2K a month. I should probably just go with them. So stuff like that, economics is always you could say a confounding factor or a primary factor in some cases, but that can overwhelm your whole identity stack in some cases.
Yeah, I was going to ask a very similar question on those lines. Like, I think the stratification of these jatis, I think it's really interesting because I imagine in many cases it's probably formed with like good intentions of like, earlier we were talking about these scheduled castes and certain ethnic groups that are maybe underrepresented and lower socioeconomic. So it's like, let's make government policy specifically to uplift them. But then to do that, like you said, you need to draw these lines, and then that creates other problems of, just kind of battling between these groups now. And I was just reflecting, like, I feel like I think there's probably like you mentioned, there's similar things that happen in all countries, if not on the basis of caste, it's based of all these other variables. I think of the Australian situation, and I think over here, like on the basis of say things like race, I think the culture, it's quite so averse to doing that in terms of segregating based on racial background, where like, for example, last year we had this whole referendum thing, which would essentially give a separate special power to the indigenous people here to kind of let them have a voice on the, for legislation and policy and things like that. And a lot of people were opposed to it, I think, purely from that point of view. It's like, well, this group gets to have a special power, then what about my group? I think that was off to me. I think that's the reason why that kind of fell over. That was a form of stratification, which again, positive intention of like, we need to uplift this group, but it's more that the consequences of that people were a bit worried about. I guess I was just thinking, I was just thinking about the American election and kind of, I don't know if you have any thoughts around kind of some of the parallels that we're seeing in India around the stratification, kind of maybe what role that might have played into this election that we just saw. In terms of how the political parties kind of operate, and they probably kind of go after similar groups and populations. Is that kind of what you observed on that side as well?
America's kind of rhyming with India, and that it's going the opposite way. We're becoming less racialized. I think for the past 10 years, if not even more, we've had a lot of emphasis on identity, on race. But then when you see some of the exit polls and the, demographic results of the election, you're starting to see more support, I think, for the Republican Party, more support amongst Black men, a lot more support amongst Latino men. I'm guessing, I still haven't seen Asian men, but I've seen Indian men stuff, and they're definitely trending towards the Republican Party. You're seeing, I think there is a higher male vote turnout for the Republicans, and this is probably a more unique part about America, the polarization that's happening between genders. So yeah, I think in America, at least on a racial or ethnic lens, it's becoming more, mixed and centralized. You're seeing kind of a post-racial electorate in a way. It still matters for sure, but it's becoming less than prior. But on gender, it seems to be polarizing a bit more, I'd say.
Yeah, that's really
I've
interesting.
also heard a lot of people talk a lot about the immigration policies between the two different parties. Could you explain, as someone who doesn't know too much, I know that Trump talks a lot about being very strict on immigration, and I don't know too much about what the Democrats talk about on that regard. For a lot of people that might be interested in this, because there's obviously a lot of talk around the personalities, but at the level of policy, are you aware of what the differences are on that front?
So it has to be put with an asterisk, because in the last 4 years, one of the reasons Harris lost was because of the huge amount of people coming over the border, illegal immigration, essentially. I think I saw a stat that said like 6% of the Nicaraguan population has come into America. I don't know the exact numbers. I don't know if it's like 11 million total or more. I don't know if you could count it, because they're called illegal for a reason. They can't find everyone, but the border was pretty open for the past 4 years, and that hurt Harris Biden. Harris tried to pivot at the end. I don't know if that's genuine, but we could see from she tried to moderate and say she's going to fix the border, blah, blah, blah. I guess people weren't buying it. But from this, you could say that, hey, Democrats at least seem a bit more open to illegal immigration. I think from what I've seen, I don't pay attention to legal as much. And Indians are a special case. I'll get to that after. But I would guess at this point, Democrats maybe are a bit more friendly towards legal as well. Some may argue maybe they're not. Maybe Republicans are equal or more, but let's just say, let's just say they're either equal to Republicans or more friendly on legal immigration, but just a bit more. When it comes to Republicans, there's obviously the crazy wing that's like, send everyone back. We're going to deport everyone, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's going to happen. Even illegal immigrants, I don't think they're really going to be able to deport that many people, just because of logistics and stuff. Maybe some criminals for show, but I don't think it's going to be that many people. Let's see what they could do. So Republicans seem very anti-illegal immigrant in general, like totally. Legal, again, I can't really say. I think they're probably not as friendly as Democrats in general. There's always the crazies who say they don't want any more legal immigration. And with Stephen Miller and a few other key people in the Trump admin, they do definitely have shades of being even hostile to legal immigration. But yeah, I think that's the best way I could put it up. But for Indians, I've heard there's a unique backlog for them. I don't know the exact details, but to become a citizen as an Indian, it's extremely, extremely, extremely difficult. And I think China is another country, but Indians especially, I've heard, are discriminated against on that quota for people who immigrate to America.
Mm. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely very interesting. And I think what I'm kind of also observing or maybe extrapolating, like you kind of mentioned when the Hillary Trump election was happening that you weren't maybe as engaged with politics. It sounds like now you're at a point where you're quite across a lot of the policies and the things that are happening. Do you feel that like connecting more with Indian politics and kind of just understanding how these social structures and political systems work from an Indian context kind of made you more engaged in the Western sort of context as well, by kind of like there's obviously, like you said, a lot of parallels, and you were able to understand those general mechanisms in a context that's more, you can connect with better, because that's your cultural origin, but then apply those same ideas and principles with this Western world that like you're like, oh, okay, now I understand why Trump is doing this and why Kamal is doing this. It's the same as how Modi is operating there, and etc. Did you find that was applicable or transferable?
Yeah. So one reason I got really into Indian politics is I realized American politics don't really apply to India. It's very horrendous to try to transplant that. However, vice versa, it's not, that definitely applies. Because Indian politics is like, I said, politics times 100 or 1,000. And there's this one quote from the Mahabharata. And I'm going to butcher it. I'll say it anyways. It's basically like, whatever is here is found everywhere. Whatever is not isn't found anywhere. So essentially, any type of politics or all politics, how politics happens, you could find in India because it's so ancient, it's so big, it's so wide, it's so diverse. Various social dynamics. There's so many different groups, politics. I think Donald Liu, he works in the State Department or something, and he's the type of guy who tries to topple governments, basically. He tries to interfere in governments and interfere in their politics and stuff. So he describes politics in India as a blood sport. And I think that's really what it is. He describes it as politics as it should be. And I think if you learn Indian politics, you could transplant concepts from there in most other countries, just because of the depth and the width of India.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think for me personally, that even gives me more motivation to kind of want to explore some of that stuff, because I find that sometimes I'm not as engaged with Australian politics, but part of it is that there's not that many representatives that look like myself that I can sort of relate to, and that does help. Not to say that that should be a deal breaker, but I think going in a familiar context where I can engage with the law a bit easier to understand that, and then bringing that here is a good idea. But in terms of then with that knowledge of Indian politics, I guess I'm curious, have you found any opportunities to kind of influence some of the systems and the things that are happening there? I mean, part of it, of course, is you're doing great work in raising awareness, for people. But as being a second gen person, I guess the thing I think about sometimes is being disconnected. And, if I even go there, I'll be seen as a foreigner and, not really be given much of a platform or anything. So like, what can I do from here to maybe create influence there? If not political, maybe economic. I don't know. Any ideas on that front?
Influencing India is really, really difficult because it's just so big. And then you have to compete with people who are much more competitive. Competing in India is something else than competing outside of it. I mean, the number one way to influence, I guess, is just economically, because there is that economic advantage from the diaspora vis-a-vis India. I've not thought about my own influence too much. I know some people follow me. I know they read me or watch my videos and stuff. But yeah, influencing India, probably the monetary path is the best way.
Could you expand on that? So economically, like, do you mean say investing in Indian companies, or like what's an example of economic?
Yeah, investing in India. One thing, and I told my friends this, I remember, and they thought I was an idiot when I would tell them in like 2017 or something, when I really started getting into India and I started to believe that, hey, this country is gonna start to do really well. I think there's a lot of, changes happening and it's going in a good direction. You invest in like Nifty or one of these ETFs like INDA or whatever. Obviously not financial advice, but investing in the country is obviously one of the biggest ways you can influence it. Um, I think that's the easiest way, or like your actual company. Influencing it via content, that takes a really long time. Like technically, if you think about like Dhruv Rathi, like he's one of the biggest influencers. He's, in Germany or whatever. Yeah, he speaks Hindi, but he's outside of India, fundamentally. He is diaspora technically. Uh, he worked very, very hard to get where he is. Whether you agree with him or not, it took him years to get that big. So via content, I don't know if that's the best way, but via investing. Some people, I guess they do NGOs, but NGO stuff is it's kind of testy in India, especially with the politics and stuff. So yeah.
No, that makes sense. I think that's really interesting. And I think we're probably coming to the conclusion of the talk. So maybe any final questions from you guys. But I think from me, the takeaways I've kind of gotten from today is that there is sort of a lot of value to for us as diaspora, second gen, in the Western world and other parts of the world to sort of reconnect with some of these roots. And we talked about it from a spiritual and religious cultural point of view, but then also social history, political history, and current, what's happening there. The value being, it can help guide us in our own lives. There's a lot of knowledge and wisdom there that's still timeless and applicable. There's the cultural preservation aspect. There's learning political structures that we can use to understand our own current context. And the last thing was around potentially even creating change back in the motherland through economic or even just kind of financially, even if you're not interested in influence, even just to profit. Like India is an emerging economy and there's probably money to be made. Having this understanding will probably help you uncover opportunities. So for all these reasons, I think there's value to doing some of this research and stuff. And I think the Emissary, you're definitely a fantastic resource to start with. I know I watched some of your YouTube videos, which are really well made, and that gave me a lot of very like for a beginner friendly. Like I think you gave a lot of breadth, but also depth. So yeah, really keen to follow your journey, Akshar, and see where you go.
Thanks, bro.
Anuraj, Dylan, Rajas, any kind of concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I just had kind of two short questions. It's kind of tying back to Jatitva, but you spoke about how I was rereading an article the other day, and you mentioned how Jatitva presents Hinduism as like they use the word ruse of ruin, and you said Hindutva as a political conspiracy. And the most interesting thing was I got the first 2 points, but the Indian state as an economic oppressor. You might have touched on this, but can you explain that where you came to that conclusion of people who subscribe to this idea of Jatitva looking at the Indian state as an economic oppressor? Because I struggle to make the link. Yeah.
That's a really good question. So I'll give you live examples. For someone who's of, say, like a, so-called lower caste or whatever, especially SC, ST, sometimes OBC, whatever. When, say, a political party is trying to enact Jatitva or, implement it into a certain group, what they will say, and you kind of see it even today, especially with like Rahul Gandhi and some of the tactics he will say that, hey, the Indian state is it's made by, and it's for upper castes. They take your money and they send it to like these, super rich, fat upper castes. They're hogging all the money. They're being greedy. They use all these political cartoon imageries. That's why I said the fat thing. But they basically make it so, hey, India today is oppressing you via it being an upper caste dominion, and it's taking your money. It's it's being greedy with the money. It's not redistributing it. So that's the one micro messaging for like so-called lower caste. But they'll do this with the upper caste too, or so-called upper caste. They will say that, hey, India is actually taking your money and it's redistributing it to these OBCs, SCs, STs, and they're redistributing way too much of it. They're taking all your money, they're taking all your resources. And then they'll usually use like the affirmative action or reservation argument where, these people are taking your opportunities and stuff like that. So there's all this little micro messaging that they could use for every single caste. India is a negotiation between, a million groups, a million different minorities. So within this negotiation, some people are going to feel some type of way. And, they find what way each group is feeling, and then they micro message and tell them, your group is being taken advantage by that group. And then they go to that group and tell them they are being taken advantage of that other group. So it's a genius tactic, but I don't necessarily know if it's true or if it's the best thing to be emphasized.
Yeah, like a political bloodbath, like you said.
Yeah.
Thank you for a really, really enlightening talk, Akshar. Thanks for joining the podcast. There's so many different topics that we covered. I think Chetan synthesized it really well. But one thing I wanted to ask you as we wrap up is where do you see this journey for yourself growing, and how can our viewers and anyone who does see this podcast, how can they get in touch with your content?
So my journey, I've told myself just to keep my head down and just try to keep producing stuff. So mostly I just do writing, I do articles, and then I do videos on YouTube. You could follow me at the Emissary CO on Twitter. If you just type in the Emissary on YouTube, you'll probably be able to find me. I think I've gotten a bit lucky, so I'm starting to get more views. I'm sure we'll have it in the podcast description or something. But yeah, right now I just want to keep my head down. I'm probably going to start monetizing soon. Everything I do is for free, so you could see all my content. My monetization will probably be, some goodies in the background, but content in general is going to be free for this foreseeable future. So yeah, just engage with me on social media, follow me. If you want to, send something my way, just I'll set that up probably soon. But for now, just follow, share, comment, engage. And that's all I'm asking.
Awesome. Anything else, Dylan, Rajas, Chetan? Or else we might wrap up.
We'll save it for the next podcast. I think
that's a good one.
But no, thanks again for joining us, and thanks again for everyone for listening. See you at the next one.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Nice.
Solid. Good sesh.